What happens when one sentence on live television says more about a league's internal tension than an entire month of official statements ever could? Because that's exactly what happened when Kelsey Plum stepped into a moment that was supposed to represent unity, and somehow turned it into something else entirely. This should have been simple. A weekend built for celebration. All-star lights. Packed stands. National attention. A league finally enjoying the kind of spotlight players had spent years demanding. And right in the middle of all of that, there was a message the league wanted the public to see. The players were standing together. They were pushing for better pay, better treatment, bigger long-term opportunities. On the surface, it looked organized. It looked strategic. It looked like the kind of coordinated movement that could pressure ownership and rally fans behind the cause. But then the microphone got passed. And in one strange, awkward, completely unnecessary moment, the conversation stopped being about the message on the shirts and started being about one name again. Caitlin Clark. Not because Clark grabbed the spotlight. Not because she forced herself into the story. Not because she posted something dramatic or went looking for attention. It happened because another player brought her into it. On purpose. On camera. In front of everyone. And that's when the whole thing started to unravel. Because people watching could feel it immediately. The tone changed. The room changed. The energy changed. What was supposed to sound like solidarity suddenly sounded personal. What was supposed to feel like a labor movement suddenly felt like a grievance. And once that happened, nobody was really listening to the official message anymore. They were watching the reactions. They were reading faces. They were clipping the moment. Replaying it. Analyzing it. Turning it into the kind of viral sports drama that spreads faster than any polished PR campaign ever could. That's what made this so damaging. It wasn't just that Kelsey Plum said something petty. It was that she said it during the exact kind of moment where even the smallest bit of pettiness becomes impossible to hide. And when athletes talk under bright lights, people don't just hear the words. They hear the motive behind them. They hear the frustration. They hear the envy. They hear the subtext. And in this case, the subtext was loud. Because for months, maybe even longer, there has been a question hanging over the WNBA that nobody really wants to answer honestly in public. A question about power. A question about visibility. A question about who is actually driving the growth of this league, and who only started talking bigger once that growth had already arrived. That question was always sitting there under the surface. This moment dragged it into the open. Suddenly, it wasn't just about salaries. It wasn't just about negotiations. It wasn't just about what players are owed or what owners should pay. It became about something far more uncomfortable. It became about whether some of the league's established stars have quietly grown resentful of the one player they now seem to need the most. And that is where this story gets dangerous. Because once fans begin to suspect jealousy, everything gets reinterpreted through that lens. Every comment sounds different. Every eye roll means more. Every public jab feels calculated. Every awkward moment stops looking accidental. And when the player at the center of all that tension happens to be the biggest ratings draw women's basketball has seen in years, the stakes go way beyond hurt feelings. Now you're talking about money. Now you're talking about leverage. Now you're talking about the future shape of the league itself. And that's why this wasn't just another sports clip. This wasn't just one player making a weird comment at the wrong time. This was a revealing moment. The kind of moment that exposes the split between two different mindsets. One mindset still seems obsessed with gatekeeping the league, policing who belongs, who showed up, who said what, who gets credit, who deserves attention. The other mindset understands that the window is open right now, that the audience is bigger than it has ever been, and that the sport is standing in front of a rare opportunity to break into a completely different level of relevance. Those two mindsets cannot hide from each other forever. And for one uncomfortable stretch of live television, they didn't. What made it even worse for Plum is that the reaction didn't just come from fans. It came from right beside her. In real time. Instantly. That's what turned an awkward comment into a full-blown storyline. Because when someone sitting next to you reacts like even they can't believe what you just said, the audience doesn't need a panel discussion afterward. The verdict starts forming on the spot. And that's exactly what happened here. The clip moved because it carried that unmistakable feeling sports fans recognize immediately. Somebody said the quiet part out loud. Somebody let emotion override strategy. Somebody took a carefully managed public moment and cracked it open just enough for everyone watching to see what had really been bubbling underneath. Once that happened, there was no putting it back. And the timing could not have been worse. The WNBA is not in the same place it was a few years ago. The attention is bigger. The scrutiny is harsher. The audience is broader. Casual fans are watching now. National media is watching now. People who never used to care about league politics are suddenly paying attention to every public comment, every negotiation detail, every player reaction, every sign of division. That means mistakes hit harder than they used to. Small comments don't stay small anymore. They become headlines, debate segments, podcast clips, reposted videos, and social media battlegrounds. So when Plum spoke, she wasn't just talking to a room. She was talking to millions of people already primed to interpret the moment as evidence of something bigger. And maybe the most brutal part of all this is that Caitlin Clark didn't even need to do anything for the contrast to become obvious. That contrast was already there. One side looked frustrated, defensive, and distracted. The other looked bigger than the noise. One side seemed focused on attendance at meetings and symbolic gestures. The other seemed focused on growth, brand power, and the long game. One side kept feeding the tension. The other kept benefiting from it. That is not a good dynamic if you're trying to convince the public that everyone is unified. Because the public is not stupid. Fans can tell when a league is trying to sell togetherness while resentment keeps leaking through the cracks. And once fans see those cracks, they start asking harder questions. Questions about leadership. Questions about priorities. Questions about whether certain veterans truly understand the moment the league is in, or whether they're still acting like the biggest threat is internal competition instead of wasted momentum. That's what makes this story so much bigger than one comment. Touches everything. It touches the CBA fight. It touches player branding. It touches media strategy. It touches fan trust. It touches the league's relationship with its own explosion in popularity. And most of all, it touches the uncomfortable truth that women's basketball is growing so fast right now that not everyone seems emotionally prepared for what that growth actually means. Growth changes hierarchy. Growth changes visibility. Growth changes who the cameras follow, who the sponsors call, who networks invite, who casual fans recognize, and whose absence immediately affects ticket prices, ratings, and headlines. That kind of change is exciting from the outside. From the inside, it can feel threatening. And sometimes all it takes is one sentence for that threat to reveal itself. So that's where this begins. Not with a game-winning shot. Not with a championship moment. Not with a locker room leak. It begins with a microphone, a forced joke, an unnecessary comment, a visible reaction beside it, and a sports world that immediately understood this was about far more than one missing t-shirt appearance. Because by the time that clip finished making the rounds, one thing had become impossible to ignore. This was no longer just a conversation about fairness. It was a conversation about influence. About who actually moves the league. About who understands the moment. And about why every attempt to take a shot at Caitlin Clark somehow keeps ending the exact same way. With her looking even bigger than before. The stage couldn't have been more perfect for unity. All-Star Weekend is supposed to be the one time every year when rivalries pause for a moment. Players from different teams share the same locker rooms. The cameras are everywhere. The league is under the brightest spotlight it will see outside of the finals. It's a celebration, but it's also a message to the outside world that women's basketball is growing, that the players are aligned, and that the league is ready to demand more. This year, that message had a very specific focus. Money. For months, the conversation around the WNBA had been building toward one major turning point. The next collective bargaining agreement. Players believed the league's rapid rise in popularity meant salaries should rise dramatically as well. The argument wasn't complicated. Attendance was climbing. Broadcast deals were expanding. Merchandise was selling faster than it ever had before. The league was finally becoming a real national conversation instead of a niche one. And the players wanted their share of that momentum. So they planned something simple but effective. When cameras arrived for All-Star Weekend, players walked in wearing black shirts with a bold message printed across the front. "Pay us what you owe us." It was clean. It was direct. It was designed for social media. The shirts did exactly what they were supposed to do. Photos spread instantly. Headlines followed. Fans debated the numbers. Analysts began discussing the economics of the league. Even people who didn't usually follow the WNBA suddenly had an opinion about player salaries. From a strategy standpoint, it was working. The visual alone told a story. Dozens of athletes standing together, wearing the same message, presenting a united front to ownership. In labor negotiations, optics matter. Solidarity matters. The public needs to believe everyone is aligned behind the same goal. And for a brief moment, it looked like that alignment existed. Then the microphones came out. During one of the media sessions, Kelsey Plum was asked about the shirts and the union push behind them. This should have been easy territory. Praise the unity. Reinforce the message. Emphasize that the players were standing together. Keep the conversation focused on the broader goal. But instead of staying on script, Plum added something extra. Something nobody asked for. She leaned toward the mic and said, almost casually, "Not to tattletale, but 0 members of Team Clark were present." For a split second, the room didn't react. Then the meaning landed. Because what Plum had just done wasn't subtle. She had taken a moment that was supposed to showcase player solidarity and turned it into a public complaint about another group of players. Specifically, the group connected to Caitlin Clark. The timing made it worse. Clark was already the most talked-about player in the league. Every game she played was under a microscope. Every decision she made became a talking point. So bringing her name into the conversation, especially during a moment meant to promote unity, instantly shifted the spotlight. Suddenly, the story wasn't about the shirts anymore. It was about Clark. More specifically, it was about why Plum felt the need to call her out in front of national cameras. Fans watching the clip started asking questions immediately. Was this a joke? Was it frustration? Was it a calculated shot? Or was it simply a veteran letting personal irritation slip out at the worst possible time? Whatever the intention was, the result was the same. The narrative changed. Instead of discussing salaries and negotiation strategy, people were replaying that one line. Analysts were dissecting the tone. Social media users were arguing about the implication. And inside the room itself, the reaction from another superstar made the moment even more uncomfortable. Because sitting right next to Plum was Sabrina Ionescu. And Sabrina did not look amused. The cameras caught it clearly. The eye roll came almost instantly, followed by a quiet comment that cut through the tension. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But the message was unmistakable. What Plum had just said wasn't necessary. Sometimes the smallest reactions say the most. Sabrina didn't need a speech. The expression alone told viewers everything they needed to know. It looked like the reaction of someone who understood exactly how bad that comment sounded in the moment. Within minutes, that clip began circulating online. And here's the strange part. The union shirts, the entire visual campaign meant to promote better pay, quickly became the second most discussed thing from All-Star Weekend. The first was that awkward exchange. The eye roll. The comment. The sudden realization that the league might not be nearly as unified as it wanted the public to believe. Fans clipped the moment and shared it everywhere. Sports pages reposted it. Debate shows picked it apart. Even people who rarely followed women's basketball were suddenly watching the video just to understand why it had exploded across timelines. The reason was simple. Sports fans recognized tension immediately. And this moment had it. Because what Plum said didn't sound like someone focused on the negotiation fight with ownership. It sounded like someone frustrated with another player. It sounded like internal friction spilling out in public. And once that perception forms, it spreads quickly. Some viewers defended Plum. They argued she was simply pointing out who had participated in the protest and who hadn't. Others saw it differently. To them, It felt like unnecessary criticism directed at the one player currently driving the league's biggest surge in popularity. That debate exploded almost instantly. Why would you call out Caitlin Clark during a union moment? Why shift attention away from the collective message? Why introduce internal division when the league was trying to show unity? The questions kept coming. But while the internet argued about the comment, something else was quietly happening at the same time. Caitlin Clark herself wasn't responding to the drama at all. There was no angry statement, no emotional tweet, no defensive interview. Instead, what happened next created a contrast so sharp that it made the entire situation look even worse for Plum. Because while one player was becoming the center of controversy for something she said into a microphone, the other was calmly turning the moment into something that looked a lot more like a business opportunity. The internet expected fireworks. When a star player gets called out on live television, the usual script is predictable. Someone posts a response. A quote appears online. Maybe there's a tense interview or a social media exchange that keeps the drama alive for another news cycle. Sports controversies normally grow louder the longer both sides talk. But that's not what Caitlin Clark did. In fact, what made the situation so fascinating was how little she actually said. While the clip of Kelsey Plum's comment was racing across sports media, Clark didn't rush to defend herself. She didn't attack Plum back. She didn't start a public argument about union politics or attendance at meetings. The response came in a completely different form. A short message. Clean. Calm. Almost effortless. Clark dropped a subtle comment referencing one of her brand deals, essentially implying that she was focused on building something much bigger than arguing over who showed up to a meeting about t-shirts. That was it. No drama. No anger. Just a reminder of the scale she was operating on. And somehow that quiet response made the contrast between the two players even sharper than if Clark had launched a full rebuttal. Because suddenly people weren't comparing arguments anymore. They were comparing mindsets. On one side, you had a veteran star using a union platform to point out who didn't attend a symbolic moment. On the other side, you had the league's most talked about player acting like she barely had time to acknowledge the criticism. It looked like two completely different approaches to the same situation. And fans noticed immediately. Part of the reason Clark's response landed so well is that it fit the image she has built since entering the league. From the moment she arrived in the WNBA, Clark has operated with a kind of quiet confidence that makes controversy bounce off her in strange ways. Critics throw comments her direction. Opponents try to rattle her during games. Social media debates swirl around her name almost daily. Yet she rarely feeds the noise. Instead, she keeps doing something that irritates critics even more. She keeps moving forward. And in this particular moment, moving forward meant leaning into the part of her career that already operates at a completely different level than most players in the league. Her brand. By the time this all-star controversy happened, Clark wasn't just a rookie sensation anymore. She was already one of the most recognizable figures in women's basketball worldwide. Major companies had lined up to work with her. Her endorsement portfolio had grown at a pace rarely seen in the sport. Sponsors weren't just looking at her as a talented athlete. They saw a cultural figure. Someone capable of pulling millions of casual sports fans into women's basketball for the first time. That kind of influence changes how an athlete handles conflict. When your name is already tied to television deals, corporate partnerships, and national media appearances, getting dragged into petty arguments becomes less appealing. It starts to look like a waste of energy. Clark's reaction reflected that reality perfectly. While the internet debated Plum's comment, Clark simply reminded everyone that her focus was somewhere else entirely. The effect was immediate. Sports fans who watched both moments side by side began pointing out how different they felt. Plum's comment sounded irritated, almost defensive. Clark's response sounded like someone who understood that the biggest leverage in sports isn't complaining louder. It's becoming impossible to ignore. The more people talked about the situation, the more the conversation shifted away from the original issue. The shirts, the union messaging, and the salary debate slowly faded into the background. Instead, the spotlight turned toward the bigger theme hiding underneath the entire moment. Leadership. Who actually represents the future direction of the league? Is it the veterans who spent years fighting for recognition when the WNBA struggled to stay relevant in mainstream sports coverage? Or is it the new superstar whose arrival suddenly made networks, sponsors, and national audiences start paying attention in ways they hadn't before? Those two realities are both true, and that's what makes the tension so complicated. The veteran players deserve credit for keeping the league alive through years when resources were limited and attention was scarce. They built the foundation that allowed women's basketball to survive long enough for the current explosion in popularity to happen. But the arrival of someone like Clark introduces a completely different kind of momentum. The kind driven by viewership spikes, ticket demand, national television ratings, merchandise sales. All the economic forces that suddenly transform a sports league from something niche into something impossible to ignore. When those two forces collide, history and momentum, things can get uncomfortable. And that discomfort started showing itself more clearly after Plum's comment. Fans began analyzing every interaction between Clark and other players. Every reaction clip got studied. Every interview answer was dissected. Some people started wondering if the tension between Clark and certain veterans had been quietly building for months without anyone publicly acknowledging it. Others argued that the whole controversy was overblown, that one awkward comment had been turned into a massive storyline simply because Clark's name carries so much attention. But regardless of which side someone believed, one thing became clear. The spotlight was no longer focused on the comment itself. It was focused on the contrast. Two players, two responses, two completely different ways of handling pressure. One approach amplified the drama. The other made the drama look small. And the more that contrast spread across social media, sports talk shows, and fan debates, the more another question began floating through the conversation. If a single comment about a t-shirt meeting could create this much tension, what would happen when the much bigger issues surrounding the WNBA started coming to the surface? Because behind the All-Star Weekend drama was a negotiation battle far more serious than a viral clip. The league's entire financial future was sitting on the table. And the deeper people started digging into that situation, the stranger the story began to look. Behind the viral clips and the social media arguments, the real battle inside the WNBA wasn't happening on a stage or in front of cameras. It was happening in meeting rooms. Lawyers, union representatives, team owners, financial projections. The next collective bargaining agreement was supposed to reshape the entire economic structure of the league. For years, players had argued that the WNBA's compensation system no longer matched the growth of the sport. Television coverage was expanding. Sponsorships were increasing. Arenas were filling up more frequently than ever before. From the players' perspective, the equation looked simple. If the league was making more money, the athletes creating the product should receive a larger share of it. That message became the core of the union's public campaign. Players appeared in interviews explaining that the current system undervalued their work. Social media posts pushed the narrative that ownership had not made a serious proposal yet. The shirts worn during All-Star Weekend reinforced the same idea. The league was growing. The players wanted their cut. At first, fans largely supported the argument. For years, the WNBA had been treated like a smaller sibling to the NBA, operating with tighter budgets and less exposure. Many observers believed the players deserved a dramatic pay increase simply because the sport itself had reached a new level of visibility. But as negotiations continued, something unexpected started surfacing. Reports suggested the owners had actually put a major offer on the table already. And the numbers weren't small. According to leaked details discussed by sports analysts, the proposal included a salary structure that could transform the financial landscape of the league if revenue growth continued on its current trajectory. The maximum salary for top players could jump to roughly $1.3 million in the first year of the deal. If the league continued expanding and hitting revenue targets, that number could eventually reach $2.4 million by 2031. Even the average salary projections looked dramatically different from the current system. Instead of hovering around the six-figure range, average player earnings could eventually approach $1 million annually under the right conditions. For a league that historically struggled to break into major sports business conversations, those numbers represented a massive leap. But the public messaging coming from the union didn't reflect that offer at all. Instead, The narrative many fans heard was that ownership hadn't presented anything serious yet. That disconnect started raising eyebrows. Some analysts began asking a simple question. If an offer already existed, even if it wasn't perfect, why did the public narrative sound like negotiations had barely started? Critics of the union's strategy argued that the messaging was designed to create sympathy rather than reflect the full complexity of the negotiations. Saying, "We rejected $1 million salary framework," sounds very different from saying, "Owners have offered nothing." One version sparks debate. The other sparks outrage. And in sports negotiations, outrage can be a powerful bargaining tool. The strategy may have been intended to increase pressure on ownership. If fans believed the players were being ignored entirely, the public could turn against the league's leadership quickly. That kind of pressure sometimes forces organizations to offer better terms just to calm the situation. But strategies like that come with risks. Because once financial details start leaking, the public conversation can flip just as quickly as it formed. That's exactly what began happening. As more analysts looked at the proposed salary structure, many realized the offer wasn't insignificant at all. In fact, for a league still working toward long-term profitability, the proposal represented a massive gamble on future growth. Owners weren't just offering a raise. They were building a salary model around the assumption that the WNBA's current popularity surge would continue for years. And when people started asking what exactly was driving that surge, one name kept appearing in every discussion: Caitlin Clark. The league had experienced strong players before. It had seen talented stars and championship dynasties that dominated headlines for stretches of time. But Clark's arrival triggered something different. A spike in national television interest. Record ticket demand in multiple cities. Merchandise sales that suddenly began competing with major professional sports brands. The numbers were difficult to ignore. When Clark appeared in a game, ratings climbed. When she was absent, demand often dropped. This created a complicated dynamic inside the negotiations. On one hand, players wanted the salary increases because the league was clearly growing. On the other hand, critics pointed out that much of that growth seemed tied to a single athlete whose popularity had expanded the league's reach faster than anyone expected. That reality made some analysts uncomfortable. Relying too heavily on one superstar can create instability. If the league's financial projections depended heavily on Clark's continued success and visibility, then negotiations built around those projections carried serious risks. But at the same time, ignoring the effect she had on the business side of the league would be equally unrealistic. Owners were building their salary framework based on future revenue expectations. Those expectations were being fueled by rising ratings. And those ratings often followed Clark. That didn't mean the other players weren't talented or valuable. The WNBA had a deep roster of elite athletes, championship winners, and international stars. But business growth in sports rarely spreads evenly across every player. It tends to concentrate around the few names capable of drawing national attention. That's the part nobody inside the league seemed eager to discuss publicly. Because once you acknowledge that reality, the power dynamics change. Negotiations stop being purely about fairness. They become about influence. And influence inside a sports league isn't measured only by talent or experience. It's measured by audience, by ratings, by the ability to bring millions of new viewers into a product that previously struggled to reach them. As the CBA debate intensified, that uncomfortable truth started creeping into the conversation more frequently. Some fans began arguing that attacking or criticizing the player driving the league's biggest popularity wave didn't make much strategic sense. Others pushed back, saying the league had talented stars long before Clark arrived, and that focusing too much on one individual undermined the collective effort. The debate grew louder with each passing week. But while the public argued about economics and star power, another issue quietly started surfacing behind the scenes. An issue that made the negotiation process look far more complicated than anyone expected. Because some of the same players helping lead the WNBA's labor negotiations were also involved in building something that could eventually compete with the league itself. Just when the negotiations already looked messy, another layer of the story began getting attention. And this one had nothing to do with t-shirts, comments, or viral clips. It had to do with conflict of interest. Because some of the players helping lead the push for a new WNBA deal weren't only thinking about the WNBA's future. They were also involved in building something else. A completely different league. The project was called Unrivaled, a new professional women's basketball league designed to operate in the off-season. On paper, the idea sounded exciting. More opportunities for players. More visibility for women's basketball. More chances for athletes to earn money without needing to travel overseas during the off-season. In theory, it was a positive development. But once people started looking closer at who was involved, questions began popping up. Two of the most prominent names connected to the project were Nafisa Collier and Breanna Stewart. Both respected players. Both influential voices inside the WNBA. And both deeply involved in the discussions surrounding the league's future. Here's where things started to look complicated. Collier and Stewart weren't just participating in Unrivaled. They were co-founders. That meant they had a direct financial interest in seeing the new league succeed. Normally, that wouldn't be controversial. Athletes launching new ventures happens all the time in sports. Players invest in companies. They create media platforms. They build businesses connected to their careers. But in this situation, the timing created a strange dynamic. Because the same people helping negotiate the WNBA's labor agreement were also helping build a potential alternative basketball platform. For critics watching from the outside, that raised uncomfortable questions. If the WNBA's negotiations stalled, if the league's season faced uncertainty, if players started looking for different ways to compete and earn money, a rival league could suddenly look much more appealing. That doesn't mean anyone involved intended for that outcome. But the optics alone made people uneasy. Negotiations already require trust. Trust between players and owners. Trust inside the players' union itself. Trust that everyone at the table is pushing toward the same long-term goal. Once people began noticing the unrivaled connections, that trust started getting questioned. Fans began asking whether every voice involved in the negotiation process was fully aligned with the league's success. Analysts debated whether the situation represented a normal business move or something more complicated. Even inside basketball circles, opinions were divided. Some people argued the concern was overblown. After all, multiple professional leagues can exist at the same time in sports. Competition can actually increase exposure and opportunities for athletes. Others believed the timing created unnecessary confusion during a critical moment for the WNBA's growth. Because this wasn't a normal off-season discussion. The league was negotiating a deal that could reshape salaries, expansion plans, and revenue sharing for years to come. That kind of moment usually demands total focus from everyone involved. And yet the headlines kept drifting away from the negotiation table. Instead of hearing about productive meetings and clear progress, fans were seeing viral arguments, social media debates, and questions about leadership priorities. Then another detail surfaced that made the situation look even more chaotic. During one of the most important points in the negotiation process, a face-to-face meeting was scheduled between the players' representatives and team owners. These meetings are critical in any labor negotiation. Emails and statements can only go so far. Eventually, both sides need to sit in the same room and work through the details directly. That's where real progress usually happens. But reports suggested that two of the most visible figures connected to the union's negotiating strategy didn't attend the meeting. The absence immediately became a talking point. Inside the league, some players reportedly expressed frustration about the situation. Younger athletes especially were anxious to see a deal completed. Many of them didn't have massive endorsement portfolios or outside business ventures supporting them. They depended on the season happening. They depended on a stable agreement. And watching negotiations stall while internal controversies continued to pile up made the entire situation feel more uncertain. At the same time, the public conversation outside the league was getting louder. Sports commentators started weighing in. Fans on social media dissected every new detail. And through all of it, one strange pattern kept emerging. Every time the WNBA appeared in national headlines, the discussion kept circling back to the same central figure, Caitlin Clark. Sometimes the discussion focused on her popularity. Sometimes it focused on the treatment she received during games. Sometimes it focused on the financial impact she appeared to be having on the league. But no matter how the conversation started, her name kept returning to the center of it. That reality created a kind of tension nobody inside the league seemed comfortable acknowledging directly. Because the more attention Clark attracted, the more the WNBA's business growth seemed connected to her presence. And the more that connection became obvious, the more some fans started asking a very uncomfortable question. If the league's momentum is tied so strongly to one player, why would anyone risk creating public drama around her at all? From a pure business perspective, it didn't make sense. Sports history is filled with examples of leagues protecting the athletes who bring the most visibility to the product. Not because those players are perfect, but because their presence attracts new audiences. Those audiences eventually benefit everyone. Higher ratings lead to larger broadcast deals. Larger deals lead to bigger salaries. More attention leads to more sponsorships across the entire league. That cycle is how sports leagues grow. And by the time the All-Star controversy faded from headlines, the numbers behind the WNBA's recent growth were becoming harder for anyone to ignore. Because the data told a story far bigger than one awkward comment or one tense negotiation meeting. A story about what happens when a single athlete suddenly changes the entire economics of a league. For a long time, debates about the WNBA were built mostly on opinions. Fans argued about talent. Analysts debated strategy. Commentators discussed how the league should grow. But once Caitlin Clark entered the picture, something different started happening. The conversation began shifting away from opinions and toward something far harder to argue with. Numbers. In sports, numbers are the one thing that cuts through every narrative. They don't care about feelings, rivalries, or social media arguments. They simply show what people are actually watching, buying, and paying attention to. And when people started looking closely at those numbers, a very clear pattern began to appear. Whenever Clark played, interest in the league surged. Television ratings climbed to levels the WNBA had rarely seen before. Networks that previously treated women's basketball like niche programming suddenly began promoting games more aggressively. Broadcasters noticed something they couldn't ignore. Casual sports fans who had never followed the WNBA before were now tuning in specifically to watch Clark. The effect extended beyond television. Ticket demand followed the same pattern. Arenas that once struggled to fill seats were suddenly selling out when Clark's team came to town. Cities across the country began preparing for those matchups like they were major events. Local promotions increased. Media coverage intensified. Visiting teams often moved games to larger arenas just to accommodate the spike in interest. Then there was merchandise. Clark jerseys, shirts, and collectibles started appearing everywhere. Retailers reported sales that rivaled merchandise from far more established sports leagues. Even fans who didn't regularly follow the WNBA were buying gear simply because her name had become such a recognizable part of the sports conversation. But perhaps the most revealing statistic surfaced during one specific moment that analysts couldn't stop discussing. The All-Star Game. When Clark was originally expected to appear at the event, ticket prices surged. Demand was high. Fans across the country planned trips to see the game in person. For a league that historically struggled to draw national attention to its showcase weekend, the excitement felt like a breakthrough moment. Then Clark's injury forced her to sit out. And almost immediately, ticket prices dropped dramatically. Some reports suggested the average resale price fell by more than 50%. That kind of shift is almost unheard of in professional sports. It doesn't mean other players lack talent or star power. The WNBA is filled with elite athletes capable of producing incredible moments on the court. But business dynamics in sports rarely spread attention evenly across every player. Instead, attention concentrates around the athletes who capture the imagination of the broader audience. Right now, that athlete was Clark. Sports economists began pointing out something fascinating. The league's recent financial optimism, the kind that allowed owners to propose dramatically higher salaries during CBA negotiations, was closely tied to the assumption that the surge in popularity would continue. And that surge was closely tied to Clark. It created a situation that few leagues experience so suddenly. A rookie player had arrived and almost immediately shifted the economic trajectory of an entire professional sport. Of course, that kind of transformation doesn't happen in isolation. Clark's style of play helped fuel the excitement. Her deep shooting range, fast decision-making, and fearless confidence created highlights that traveled quickly across social media. Fans who had never watched women's basketball before suddenly found themselves sharing clips of 30-foot shots and no-look passes. But her impact extended beyond the court as well. Clark's personality, her composure during interviews, and her ability to handle constant attention made her appealing to networks and sponsors looking for someone capable of representing the sport on larger stages. That combination, elite performance mixed with mainstream appeal, is extremely rare. It's the same formula that turned athletes like Michael Jordan, Serena Williams, and Steph Curry into global sports icons. Nobody was claiming Clark had reached those heights yet. But the early signs of that kind of influence were already visible. And that's where the situation inside the WNBA started to become complicated. Because when one player begins attracting that level of attention, the entire structure of a league can shift around them. More games featuring that player get scheduled for national television. More marketing campaigns focus on their highlights. Sponsors begin designing deals around their image. And casual fans start associating the entire league with that one name. For the business side of sports, that dynamic can be incredibly valuable. For the locker room side of sports, it can sometimes create tension. Veteran players who spent years fighting for recognition suddenly find themselves sharing the spotlight with a newcomer who commands massive attention almost instantly. Even when everyone involved behaves professionally, the psychological impact of that shift can be difficult to ignore. The WNBA was beginning to experience that exact transition. And the public debate surrounding Kelsey Plum's comment had unintentionally pulled that transition into the open. Because once the numbers became part of the conversation, fans started asking a different question. If Clark's presence is driving so much of the league's growth, what role should she play in shaping its future? That question didn't have a simple answer. Some people believed the league should fully embrace the momentum and build marketing strategies around the player attracting the most attention. Others argued that focusing too heavily on one athlete risked overshadowing the rest of the league's talent. Both perspectives had merit. But while those debates continued online, Clark herself kept expanding her presence in places far beyond the WNBA court. And one appearance in particular showed just how far her influence had already reached. While the debate around the league kept getting louder, Caitlin Clark quietly stepped into a completely different spotlight. Not a WNBA arena. Not a post-game interview. A national television broadcast. Clark appeared on NBC's Basketball Night in America, sitting alongside some of the most recognizable voices in basketball. Carmelo Anthony, Reggie Miller, Maria Taylor. A panel normally reserved for NBA discussion and veteran analysts. At first glance, it could have looked like a simple guest appearance. Networks sometimes invite rising stars to sit in for a segment, smile for the camera, talk briefly about their season, and move on. But that's not how this played out. The moment the conversation started, something became clear. Clark wasn't there just as a celebrity cameo. She was there as a basketball mind. When the panel began discussing the NBA game happening in front of them, Clark jumped into the conversation naturally. She talked about spacing, shot selection, and defensive adjustments with the same kind of language analysts use when breaking down film. There was no hesitation, no nervousness, no feeling that she had stepped into unfamiliar territory. The panel noticed immediately. Instead of treating her like a guest star, they started treating her like another analyst sitting at the desk. Reggie Miller joked with her about Indiana shooters. Carmelo Anthony engaged her in conversation about the evolution of offensive playmaking. For viewers watching at home, it felt seamless. Clark looked comfortable. More importantly, she looked like someone who belonged there. That kind of presence matters more than most people realize. Because the growth of a sports league isn't only about games. It's about visibility across the entire sports media ecosystem. The athletes who move leagues forward are usually the ones who can step onto national platforms and represent the sport in ways that connect with audiences who may not watch every game. Clark was doing exactly that. Millions of viewers who tuned in for an NBA broadcast suddenly found themselves listening to a WNBA player explain basketball strategy with confidence and clarity. For some viewers, it was their first real exposure to her personality. And it worked. The conversation flowed easily. Clark spoke about her early memories of attending WNBA games as a young fan, recalling watching the Minnesota Lynx dynasty and dreaming about playing professionally someday. She talked about how the league had evolved over the years, how arenas were now selling out more frequently, and how the overall level of talent continued to rise. Her tone was optimistic, forward-looking, focused on growth rather than conflict. Then the discussion shifted toward the topic everyone had been arguing about online: the CBA negotiations. It would have been easy for Clark to avoid the subject entirely. Many athletes prefer to stay neutral when negotiations are ongoing. Saying the wrong thing in public can create complications behind the scenes. But Clark didn't dodge the question. Instead, she answered calmly. She explained that she believed the moment was bigger than just one league. That the negotiations represented an important opportunity for all of women's sports. She spoke about the progress that had already been made and expressed confidence that a deal would eventually come together. Her exact tone was what stood out. There was no frustration, no accusations, no attempt to blame anyone. Just confidence that the process would lead to something positive. That answer landed differently than many of the public statements circulating online at the time. Because while debates were raging across social media and sports talk shows, Clark sounded like someone focused on the bigger picture rather than the argument of the week. For viewers watching the broadcast, the contrast was striking. On one side of the sports media landscape, fans were arguing about internal league drama. Clips of comments and reactions were spreading across timelines. The All-Star controversy was still being dissected. On the other side, Clark was sitting on national television calmly discussing the future of women's basketball like someone who expected the league to keep growing. That difference mattered. Leadership in sports isn't always about loud speeches or emotional moments. Sometimes it shows itself through composure, through the ability to stay focused on the long-term vision while everyone else gets distracted by short-term noise. Clark's NBC appearance gave fans a glimpse of that kind of composure. It also reinforced something many sponsors and broadcasters had already noticed. Clark's influence extended far beyond the court. By this point in her career, she had already secured major endorsement partnerships. The most notable was an 8-year deal with Nike worth roughly $28 million, one of the largest endorsement contracts ever given to a women's basketball player. That agreement alone signaled how much confidence major brands had in her ability to expand the sports audience. Companies don't invest that kind of money based on talent alone. They invest based on reach, on cultural impact, on the belief that an athlete can connect with millions of people who may not normally follow the sport. Clark had already started proving she could do exactly that. And while she continued appearing on national broadcasts and building her brand, the reaction to the earlier controversy kept spreading through the sports world. Media figures began offering their own opinions. Some defended the players pushing for larger salaries. Others criticized the way certain veterans were handling the public messaging around negotiations. But one theme kept repeating itself across multiple discussions. If the WNBA truly wanted to maximize its moment of growth, creating unnecessary tension around the player drawing the most attention might not be the smartest strategy. That opinion started appearing more frequently in national sports commentary. And once major media personalities began weighing in, the conversation around Kelsey Plum's comment expanded far beyond the WNBA fanbase. Suddenly, the debate wasn't just happening among basketball fans. It was happening across the entire sports media landscape. Once the controversy escaped the boundaries of WNBA fan circles, the reaction changed dramatically. Because when national sports media gets involved, the conversation rarely stays quiet. Clips of the All-Star moment were already circulating online. The eye roll, the comment about Team Clark, the awkward energy that followed. But once major sports commentators began discussing it publicly, the situation transformed from a viral clip into something much bigger. A national debate. One of the most notable reactions came from Colin Cowherd, a host known for blunt opinions about the business side of sports. When he discussed the situation on his show, he didn't spend much time analyzing the personalities involved. Instead, he focused on what he believed was the strategic mistake behind the comment. In Cowherd's view, attacking the player driving the league's biggest surge in attention didn't make sense. He compared the situation to a band suddenly finding itself performing in a luxury venue after years of playing small clubs. When a new member joins the group and somehow helps bring massive success, the logical move isn't to create internal drama. It's to recognize the opportunity. Cowherd framed the situation in terms that were easy for casual sports fans to understand. Before Clark's arrival, he argued, the league struggled to capture mainstream attention. After her arrival, television ratings climbed and arenas began filling in cities that previously had trouble drawing large crowds. From his perspective, the smart move for everyone involved was simple: protect the momentum. Whether someone agreed with his tone or not, the message resonated with many viewers. Then another voice jumped into the conversation: Dave Portnoy, the outspoken founder of Barstool Sports. Portnoy's reaction was far less diplomatic. He shared the clip online and openly mocked the situation, arguing that criticizing the league's biggest draw during a moment meant to promote unity made no sense. His commentary spread quickly. Portnoy has a massive online following, and his audience includes many sports fans who rarely watch WNBA games. Suddenly, thousands of people who had never paid attention to the league were watching the clip and forming opinions about the controversy. That's how sports debates often expand. A small internal moment becomes a viral video. A viral video becomes a discussion topic. Then national commentators amplify the conversation until it reaches an entirely new audience. And once that happens, the original context sometimes gets lost. For viewers unfamiliar with the details of the CBA negotiations or the union strategy, the clip simply looked like one player publicly complaining about another during an event meant to showcase league unity. The optics were difficult to defend. But the media reaction wasn't the only factor driving the conversation forward. The fans were even louder. Social media comment sections filled up almost immediately. Thousands of users debated the meaning behind the exchange. Some defended Plum and argued that Clark's supporters were exaggerating the situation. Others believed the comment revealed underlying frustration among certain veterans toward the player who had quickly become the league's biggest attraction. The arguments became intense. One side claimed the WNBA had talented stars long before Clark arrived, and that focusing too much on one player ignored the contributions of others. The other side pointed to the numbers, ratings, attendance, merchandise, and argued that Clark's impact on the league's growth was impossible to deny. That back and forth continued for days. But something else interesting began happening during the debate. Fans who had only recently started following the WNBA, the very audience the league had worked so hard to attract, began defending Clark aggressively. Many of these viewers were new to women's basketball, but they had been drawn in by her highlights and style of play. To them, the criticism directed at Clark sometimes felt personal. And when new fans feel like the athlete who introduced them to a sport is being targeted unfairly, they tend to respond loudly. That reaction added fuel to the controversy. Suddenly, the conversation wasn't only about player salaries or union strategy anymore. It had become a cultural debate about how the league should treat the athlete responsible for bringing so many new viewers into the sport. Meanwhile, Clark herself continued behaving the same way she had throughout the entire situation. Calm, focused, almost completely detached from the drama. While headlines debated the controversy, she kept preparing for the next stage of her career. She kept appearing in interviews discussing the growth of the sport. She kept representing the league on national platforms with the same composed tone that had impressed viewers during the NBC broadcast. That composure created another contrast. Because while the media cycle continued to spin around the controversy, Clark's career trajectory kept moving forward at full speed. Sponsors remained interested. Networks kept inviting her onto broadcasts. Fans continued buying tickets and jerseys. The momentum surrounding her name never slowed down. And that reality led analysts to an even bigger question. If the league was entering the most important financial negotiation period in its history, and if the player driving the biggest wave of attention was also the one showing the most composure during the controversy, what would the WNBA actually look like once the new CBA finally came together? Because when the dust settled, the next version of the league could end up looking very different from the one that existed before Clark arrived. At some point, the noise fades. Every sports controversy eventually reaches that moment where the arguments slow down, the headlines stop repeating the same clips, and the attention shifts toward what actually comes next. For the WNBA, that next phase is tied directly to the collective bargaining agreement. Because once a deal is finalized, it won't just settle the salary debate. It will unlock a completely new version of the league. Expansion teams are already waiting in the background. Cities like Portland and Toronto have been preparing to join the league, bringing new markets, new fans, and new revenue opportunities. But those plans depend heavily on the financial structure created by the next CBA. Without a finalized agreement, those expansion timelines remain uncertain. With one, the league could begin a period of growth unlike anything it has experienced before. More teams means more roster spots. More roster spots means more opportunities for players. And more markets means more national attention. That's where the economics of the situation start to become clear. The owner's proposal wasn't simply about raising salaries. It was built around the idea that the WNBA is entering a growth phase that could dramatically increase revenue over the next decade. If that growth continues, the numbers become massive. Under the projections discussed during negotiations, the maximum salary could jump to around $1.3 million immediately, with the possibility of reaching $2.4 million by 2031 if revenue targets are met. For many players, that kind of increase would completely transform the financial reality of their careers. Right now, the average WNBA salary sits around $120,000, and the current maximum is just under $250,000. That's a huge difference compared to the salaries projected under the proposed framework. But there's a catch. Those numbers only become reality if the league's popularity keeps rising. That means more viewers, more ticket sales, more sponsorship deals, more television contracts. And when analysts examine what has driven the recent surge in those areas, the answer keeps pointing in the same direction. Caitlin Clark. That doesn't mean she's the only reason the league is growing. The WNBA is filled with talented athletes who have spent years building the sport's foundation. Championship teams, Olympic stars, and elite international players all played roles in keeping the league competitive and exciting. But the current surge in national attention is tied closely to Clark's arrival. Her games generate the highest ratings. Her highlights dominate social media. Her presence alone changes ticket demand in multiple cities. That kind of influence shapes how leagues evolve. When one player becomes the center of attention, the league often begins building its future around the opportunities created by that attention. Sponsors invest more heavily. Networks schedule more broadcasts. Marketing campaigns start revolving around the athlete who attracts the largest audience. In many ways, the WNBA appears to be entering that exact moment right now. Clark's influence has already expanded beyond the league itself. Her endorsement deals continue growing. Her appearances on national broadcasts introduce new viewers to the sport. Her social media presence reaches millions of fans who may never have watched a WNBA game before. Even if negotiations stall temporarily, Clark's career remains secure. Her 8-year Nike deal worth roughly $28 million ensures that her financial future doesn't depend solely on league salaries. Her brand has grown large enough to exist independently of the WNBA schedule. That's not the case for most players. For many athletes across the league, the next CBA will determine the financial stability of their careers. They depend on the league's continued success. They depend on the season happening on schedule. They depend on the revenue growth that would make those higher salaries possible. And that's why the outcome of these negotiations matters so much. If the league can maintain its momentum, the future could look dramatically different. Higher salaries, more expansion teams, bigger television contracts, a larger global audience for women's basketball. All of those possibilities depend on the same fundamental factor: growth. And right now, the strongest symbol of that growth is the player who unintentionally became the center of this entire controversy: Caitlin Clark. When Kelsey Plum made that comment on live television, she may not have expected it to spark such a wide conversation. But in many ways, the moment revealed something the league had been quietly wrestling with for months. A transition. The WNBA is moving from one era into another. The previous era was built by players who fought tirelessly to keep the league alive during years when attention and resources were limited. The new era is emerging during a time when millions of new fans are suddenly discovering the sport. Those two eras don't always blend smoothly. Change rarely does. But the direction the league ultimately chooses will shape its future for years to come. Because once the next CBA is finalized and the new season begins, the conversation will shift away from comments and controversies. It will shift toward the games again. And when that happens, the question everyone will be watching closely is simple. Who will lead the WNBA into its next chapter? If you enjoy deep breakdowns of stories like this and want more content that exposes the hidden dynamics shaping the world of basketball, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Subscribing helps the channel grow and ensures you don't miss future videos covering the biggest stories in sports. Also leave a like on the video if you found this breakdown insightful, because that helps the algorithm push the content to more viewers who are interested in basketball analysis. And finally, drop your opinion in the comments below. Do you think Kelsey Plum's comment was blown out of proportion? Or did it reveal a deeper divide inside the WNBA? Your perspective helps shape the conversation, and we read every comment. So let us know what you think.